They called her the Map Child. Annalise Ward, age 8, orphaned and mute, drew places no one had told her about, cabins lost to rot, towns swallowed by rivers, and buildings that hadn't existed for decades. Her hands moved while she slept, etching churches with no steeples and houses with no windows. At first, the nuns thought it was imagination. Then, a historian matched one of her sketches to a burned plantation buried deep in the Louisiana swamps, one that hadn't been spoken of in over 60 years. They excavated the site, and what they found beneath the floorboards were bones. Many bones. They didn't notice the maps at first. At Fogwood Orphanage, the walls were already scribbled with age scratches, water stains, forgotten carvings from long-dead children. But then came the new lines, perfect arcs, tiny hatch marks, rivers rendered in soot. The sisters blamed one of the boys until they found Annalise Ward in the east corridor, kneeling with a piece of coal, and her eyes shut tight. Her hand moved in slow, practiced strokes, not frantic like a child pretending, but deliberate, as if she were copying something she could see on the inside of her eyelids. The drawing was of a bridge, crooked and half collapsed, flanked by pine trees, leaning the wrong way. She had never been outside Fogwood's gates, never seen a forest or a bridge, and yet the grain of the wood was etched, the nails placed just where old builders would have hammered them. Sister Agnes slapped the coal from her hand. Annalise didn't flinch. Her eyes fluttered open once the drawing was done, and she said nothing. She never did, not since the night she arrived, carried through the rain with a fever and no name but the one pinned to her collar, A. Ward stitched in red thread. She was 6 then, now she was 8 and still hadn't spoken a word, but she had started to draw, and what she drew made people uneasy. The nuns scoured her room and took away every pencil, every bit of charcoal, even burnt matches from the stove. Still, the drawings came. On the back of curtains, on her sheets, scratched into her wooden bed frame with the metal edge of a broken button. Maps of nowhere, places that didn't exist, places that should not exist. One night, she covered the entire underside of her bunk with a town, a perfect aerial view of streets, churches, a river winding through it all like a snake. The chapel bell tower had no cross. The cemetery sat outside the walls, fenced in iron, with a single grave circled in red. When Sister Winifred saw it, she crossed herself twice and whispered, "Witchcraft." But they couldn't stop her. Even when they locked her alone in the attic, Annalise scratched new maps into the dust with her fingernails. One morning, she was found asleep beside a drawing that showed Fogwood itself, the building drawn from above, every hallway accounted for. But in the cellar, on the map, and only on the map, was a door, one that didn't exist in real life. The headmistress ordered the wall checked. Behind the bricks was a rotted wooden frame, long sealed shut. And on the other side of that door, a staircase that led nowhere but down. Fogwood was the kind of place built to outlive its children. Perched on the edge of a marsh in Western Virginia, the orphanage loomed like a forgotten thought. Tall, narrow, windows too thin to be useful, and too many to feel right. The walls sweated even in winter, and the floors groaned like something beneath them was shifting in its sleep. It had once been a boarding house for widows, then a convalescent home, and finally, a place for the unwanted. Children who arrived at Fogwood learned quickly not to ask questions, not to cry too loud, and never to draw attention to themselves. The rules were not written, but they were sacred. Pray before breakfast, hands folded during hymns, speak only when spoken to. Anything outside that rhythm earned lashes or isolation. Annalise Ward disrupted rhythm simply by existing. She did not laugh, she did not scream, and she never made a sound, not even in her sleep. The other children called her Ghost Girl, not out loud, but in whispers, traded across beds when the nuns were out of earshot. They watched her with the same mix of fear and fascination reserved for strange animals or buried things with teeth. It wasn't just the silence. It was her hands, the way they moved with intent, the way they never trembled, the way they worked like they were older than her body. When she drew, it was like the room pulled tighter around her. Air thickened. Shadows lingered. One boy swore he saw her sketch a house that blinked. Another claimed her newest map had his name scratched into a gravestone in the corner. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. What mattered was that no one sat next to her at meals. No one dared touch the drawings. And the sisters, those stone-faced women who walked like judges and spoke like crows, prayed louder in her presence. When Annalise once muttered a word in her sleep, Sister Agnes doused her with holy water. She never spoke again. In the chapel, she was kept 3 pews back. In group chores, she was paired only with the wall. The attic had been her punishment space, but now it was hers alone. No one else wanted it, not after they saw the floorboards covered in red thread. Not after they heard the bell toll at midnight when no one had touched the rope. Fogwood tolerated her only because it was too old to change. And yet, beneath its rituals and routines, the building seemed to listen. The walls bowed toward her when she walked. Doors creaked open when her fingers grazed the knobs. The old house didn't love her, but it recognized her. Like call to like, silence answered silence. And, in the stillness between breath and heartbeat, Annalise drew the world it had buried. The morning they found the swamp house drawn under her bed, the light wouldn't come in through the windows. Not fully. The sun was up, but the halls stayed dim, as if the walls themselves were trying to keep something out or in. Sister Winifred discovered the drawing first, crouching low to sweep the attic floor when her hand touched something dry and papery beneath the cot. She pulled it free with the tips of her fingers and unfolded it with care she did not yet understand. The sketch was large, done in layers of charcoal and rust-colored ink. A house hunched on crooked stilts stood in the middle of a black swamp, trees leaning in like watchers, Spanish moss dripping from every branch like webbing. The water around the house was so carefully shaded it looked like glass. And in the window, a face, barely more than a smudge, but unmistakably watching. Sister Winifred brought the paper to the headmistress, and by nightfall the sisters were whispering over it in the candlelit hallway, voices sharp and breathless. When they confronted Annalise, she was sitting at the far end of the dormitory, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes open but distant, like she was still asleep with her body awake. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared past them, as if the house in the swamp still hovered somewhere behind their shoulders. They locked the drawing in the chapel safe. It didn't matter. The next night, another version appeared, this one drawn into the dust beneath the floorboards, exact in every detail. By the third morning, the local paper arrived by carriage, with a story printed on the front page. Surveyor discovers sunken cabin in Blackmere bog structure, matches historical records of burned-out homestead, 1,819. The image attached was a rough sketch from the surveyor. It matched Annalise's drawing line for line. The sisters did not speak of it again, but they began burning her sheets instead of washing them. They sent for a priest. They sent for a doctor. They sent for anyone who could explain how a child who had never stepped beyond the orphanage walls could map a ruin lost in the swamp for over 60 years. No one came, and still she drew, not for attention, not for praise, but like her hands needed it, like something behind her eyes couldn't be held in. That night, Sister Agnes found ink beneath her fingernails, black, wet, and warm, though she hadn't been given a pen in days. Her fingers were twitching even in sleep, as if writing on the air. And on the wall above her bed, a new line was beginning to form. A chimney, a slanted roof, a church bell without a steeple, and in the doorway, already taking shape, a shadow with a hand raised, not in welcome, but in warning. He arrived on the 5th day after the sketch, surfaced tall, pale, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that scanned the room like he was always reading, even when nothing was written. Mr. Theodore Penrose was a historian by trade, though the word didn't quite fit him. He didn't collect facts, he hunted them, and when the sisters sent word about the child's drawing and the matching ruin in Blackmere Bog, he boarded the next train with a suitcase full of old maps and a suspicion he didn't want to name. Fogwood made him uneasy, the kind of unease that settles in the ribs, not the mind. He was led through the halls, past rows of shuttered windows, and children who stopped talking the moment his shadow passed. In the attic, they showed him the girl, sitting barefoot beside the hearth, her hands smudged with soot and something darker. She didn't look at him, but he felt her attention like static in the air. Then they gave him the drawing, the first one, the one pulled from beneath her bed. He unfolded it slowly, breath catching on the edges. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was exact. He had seen this house before, not in person, but in fragments journals, faded ledgers, yellowing deeds filed under vanished names. It was a sugar plantation called Briarhearth, once owned by the Calloway family, rumored to have burned down in the spring of 1819, under circumstances never recorded and never spoken of. No photographs existed, only a single crude sketch from a groundskeeper who vanished the year after. That sketch now sat locked in Penrose's office drawer, 200 miles away. And yet, here it was again, redrawn by a child who could not possibly know of it. She had added things the original hadn't. Ropes hanging from branches, names carved into the siding, a reflection in the swamp water that didn't match the house it mirrored. He asked to speak with Annalise. The sisters refused. He insisted, and so they brought her into the chapel, sat her before him in the third pew, and waited. She stared at his shoes, said nothing. He spoke gently, told her about Briarhearth, about the fire, about the bones found in the flooded root cellar. She didn't react, but her hands twitched, not her fingers, her palms, like something underneath was shifting. He asked her if she'd seen the house in a dream. She blinked once, asked if someone had told her about it. Nothing. Asked if she remembered it. Her eyes moved up, met his. And that was enough. That night, when Penrose returned to the inn, he found a slip of paper beneath his door. On it was a drawing in fresh ink, a long country road, a dead oak tree, and a sign nailed to the bark, with one word etched in crooked letters: return. The earth didn't want to give them up. That's what the men said, wiping sweat and swamp mud from their necks as the shovels struck root, stone, and silence. At first, they thought it was just more debris timber from the old Calloway house, collapsed beams swallowed by the bog. But then came the hollow sound, not wood, not rock, something softer, something wrong. The first bone surfaced just after dusk, long, narrow, unmistakably human. The sheriff ordered the crew to stop digging, but the men were already backing away, whispering. A second bone followed, then a third. Then a small, perfect jaw, still holding one milk tooth. They uncovered 12 remains that first night. By morning, the number had doubled. None were intact. Skulls had been cracked open. Limbs had been arranged, stacked, not buried. A pattern emerged, though no one spoke of it aloud. The bodies had been aligned in 2 rows, like pews facing an altar that no longer stood. No headstones, no markers, just a ring of rusted nails where a wall might have once been. The site was declared sacred ground within hours. Reporters were turned away. The church was called, and by the second day, black cloth had been draped around the dig site, hiding it from the eyes of the curious. But nothing could unsee what had been unearthed. One of the younger workers, a boy named Caleb, quit on the spot. Said he saw something beneath the ribs of one skeleton, something white and folded, like a piece of paper. When he reached for it, it dissolved. Penrose arrived on the 3rd morning. He didn't speak when they showed him the bones. He only removed his hat, pressed it to his chest, and stared. Not with horror, but with recognition. He had read about this, not in history books, but in letters smuggled from plantations. Accounts of a house built on stolen graves, of screams beneath floorboards, of a child who once drew birds with their beaks sewn shut. And now, more than 60 years later, the house was gone, but the children remained. When he returned to Fogwood that evening, he brought with him a photograph of the site, grainy, sepia-toned, showing the bones arranged in the mud like an unfinished sentence. He asked to show it to Annalise. The sisters refused. He left the photo with them anyway. That night, the attic door unlocked itself. The next morning, A new drawing appeared beside her cot, a circle of figures kneeling in the dirt, heads bowed, hands folded in prayer. All of them were children, all of them were missing their eyes, and in the center stood a girl in a white dress, her face blank, but her hands reaching outward, as if offering something invisible, or asking for something back. They thought it would stop if they took away the pencils, if they burned the coal scraps, stripped her linens, locked her hands at night. But ink finds its way, and so does memory. The night the chapel bell cracked mid-ring, Sister Agnes stormed the attic with a broom in one hand and a Bible in the other. She meant to scare Annalise into silence. Instead, she found the floor trembling, not shaking, breathing. Beneath the cot, the floorboards were bowed, pressed upward by something pushing from below. The sisters pried up the planks the next morning and uncovered a hollow space, no larger than a suitcase. Inside were pages, hundreds of them, some drawn on parchment so old it curled like dried leaves, others on torn hymnals, candle wrapping, even the backs of discarded Bibles, all of them covered in sketches, all in the same hand, all impossibly precise. One showed a town square with no people, just open windows and a line of chairs facing nothing. Another revealed a crumbling church sunken into marshland, its steeple missing, but a single candle still lit in the nave. A spiral staircase that went down, down, but ended in a stone wall with scratches all around the bottom step. A long hallway, lined with closed doors, 12 on one side, none on the other, and a bridge made of bone. Penrose arrived before they could burn the collection. He examined the pages for hours, never speaking, only whispering place names to himself, names he recognized from old cartographer logs, letters never published, colonial ghost towns swallowed by forest, all real, all gone. He laid out 50 maps in the chapel, cross-checking them against state records, but a third of the locations were nowhere. They had never been named, never appeared on any official registry. Yet, the detail in each sketch suggested not imagination, but memory. Annalise had drawn them from above as if she had seen the land before the trees grew back, before the rivers changed course, before the graves were forgotten. The staff said nothing. They simply sealed the pages in a box and buried it beneath the altar. Out of sight, they hoped, out of reach, but Annalise didn't need the drawings anymore. She'd begun etching locations into the frost on her window, tracing doorways onto the glass, humming to herself a tune no one could name. When Sister Winifred wiped the paint clean, she found words scrawled in breath. He's still looking. That same night, a new drawing surfaced, pinned to the underside of her pillow, an open field under black sky, with hundreds of white flags planted in neat rows. At the center, one flag had been torn in half, and beneath it, in the smallest handwriting yet, were the words, "Dig here." The drawing appeared folded beneath her dinner plate, untouched and clean despite the stew spill that had soaked the table. Sister Agnes unfolded it cautiously, expecting another map or ruin, but this was different. It showed a single cabin, crooked and brittle, deep in a thicket of pine, so densely sketched it made the paper seem darker around the edges. One window was lit. In that yellow square, a figure stood, not just a shadow, but a woman, gaunt, dressed in mourning black, veil obscuring her face, hands pressed flat to the glass, like she was trying to hold the gaze of whoever dared look. The sisters said nothing. They did not show it to Penrose. They burned the drawing that night in the chapel furnace, reciting psalms until the last ember curled. But they didn't check her mattress, or the hollow behind the wallboard where she kept the copies. 3 nights later, a hunter from the neighboring village wandered into Blackmere Bog after dusk. He claimed to be following a white fox, something he'd never seen in those woods before. Instead, he found a cabin, just as she had drawn, the same twisted chimney, the same sagging porch, same single window, glowing faintly with a light that shouldn't have existed in that stretch of dead land. He never stepped closer. He never knocked. Because as he lifted his rifle, the light in the cabin went out. And then the woman in black appeared in the doorway. She didn't move, just stood there, veil fluttering slightly as if the wind were breathing inward. He dropped his gun, ran for hours. When they found him the next morning, he was barefoot, eyes swollen, mud dried into the corners of his mouth. He would not speak the name of the place. But when Sister Winifred showed him the original sketch kept hidden in her desk, copied from memory, he sobbed and asked if the girl had drawn any more, if the woman ever left the cabin, if she could follow. Annalise was watching from the top of the stairs. She hadn't eaten in days, but her hands were smudged with charcoal again. That night, when Penrose crept into the attic to check on her, he found a new drawing pinned above her bed. It was the same woman, but this time the figure was outside the cabin, standing on the path, halfway through the woods. Closer, beneath it, a single line of text had been written in a hand too steady for a child. She saw me too. It began with a whisper, not a word, but the sound of breath curling around something too heavy to say aloud. Sister Agnes had been dozing in the chapel when she heard it, a voice, small and dry, coming from the back pew. Annalise stood there barefoot, eyes wide, mouthing something over and over. The sister leaned in, expecting nonsense or a prayer, but what she heard froze her throat. He will drown with his eyes open. Nothing else. Just that. Said plainly, like a fact already written down somewhere. The girl had not spoken in over 2 years, and now, suddenly, she spoke in sentences that felt like sentences from tombstones. The priest was called in haste. Father Dorian, old and crooked, with wine-blown hands and a face that had long since stopped being surprised by sin. He sat with Annalise in the old reading room, while the sisters watched through a crack in the door. She sat still, humming to herself as he asked her name, her age, her favorite hymns. She didn't answer, until he placed a cross on the table between them. Then she looked up, tilted her head, and asked, "Do they still ring the bell at Calrow Hill?" The priest blinked. Calrow Hill had been a monastery burned down during the riots in 1823. No one had spoken its name in decades. He leaned in, asked how she knew that place. "Because I died there," she said, voice flat, not as her, but before. She pressed her palm to the table, then turned it over, showing ink where none had been, seconds before a series of numbers and lines that, when mapped, would later mark the site where 3 bodies were discovered near the riverbed. That night, she murmured phrases in her sleep, names no one had told her, dates yet to come, descriptions of men and women no one had met, but whose deaths would arrive just as she described. The red roof will catch first. The baby will not cry. He'll try to dig, but the dog will bark too late. By the end of the week, Father Dorian no longer called her cursed. He called her a vessel, not possessed, not damned, just open. Something was speaking through her, and it was old, older than the church, older than the ground the orphanage was built on. He warned the sisters not to silence her. "She's not drawing," he said, voice hollow. "She's remembering, and memory that old it doesn't fade. It waits." The next morning, Annalise was found curled in the chapel's front pew, clutching a sketch to her chest. It showed a man falling down a well, eyes wide, mouth open, arms reaching towards something unseen above. The ink was still wet, and 3 days later, a local gravedigger, unknown to her, unseen by her, was found drowned in an abandoned cistern outside Belmare, hands clawed bloody from trying to climb out, eyes open. Just like she said, the drawing showed up with no ceremony, slipped beneath Penrose's door like a warning folded in half. It was clean, sharp, far more detailed than any she had made before, an entire town etched in ink, sitting beside a river that no longer existed on any current map. Streets paved in brick, a clock tower stopped at 717, a row of houses, each with curtains drawn, each casting shadows that didn't quite match their angles. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky script, Elbridge. Penrose froze. That name was not supposed to exist anymore. Elbridge had been erased in 1847, swallowed in a flood so sudden it left no time for rescue, no chance for escape. The town had never been rebuilt. Most said it had never existed at all. No records survived. No graves were found. Just whispers passed down in certain Virginia farmsteads, warnings to never follow the river bend past dusk. That drawing changed everything. Penrose took it to the county archives. The map clerk paled. He'd heard of the place from his grandfather, who called it the town that drowned wrong. Days later, a curious trio of locals, two boys and their uncle, set off down the trail behind Fogwood, past the old markers, into the woods where the river used to run. They found stones arranged in a perfect ring, a path worn into the earth that hadn't been walked in decades, and the smell sour, sweet, metallic. The boys returned pale and silent. The uncle did not return at all. His body was found 3 mornings later, washed up in the reeds where no water should have flowed, lungs full, skin bloated, and eyes wide with something that had nothing to do with drowning. The sheriff ruled it a heart attack. But one of the boys, 17, fevered, slipping between silence and mumbling, whispered something before his mind broke completely. They were still in the houses, he said. They looked at me, from inside. The orphanage tightened after that, windows nailed shut, attic barred. Penrose demanded they stop hiding the sketches, stop burning the ones they feared. She's not guessing, he snapped. She's remembering places we tried to forget. But no one listened. That same night, Annalise slipped a new page under her pillow. It was Elbridge again, but this time the buildings were cracked open like skulls. The clock tower had no face. And in the center of the street stood 12 chairs facing outward, empty, all but one. In that one sat a figure in white, her face hidden behind a curtain of black hair, and in her lap, folded neatly, was a map of the next town she would visit. Fogwood, ink still wet. The name came from a page no one meant to find. Penrose was scouring the diocesan ledgers for mention of Elbridge when he came across a misplaced burial record, thick parchment, water-damaged, the ink fading like it was ashamed to still exist. It listed the death of a girl in the year 1793. No first name, just Miss Ward, aged 11, cause, unnatural fire, body, unrecovered, witness, silenced, nothing more. No location, no kin, only a final line, almost too faint to read. She consumed what could not be buried. He read it twice, then again. Then again, a girl, same age, same surname, lost in flame. But something about the phrasing refused to rest. Consumed? Not was consumed, she consumed. He brought the page to the sisters. They went pale. Sister Agnes whispered a name she hadn't said in years, the girl who ate ash. An old tale told by candlelight to scare the children into obedience. A girl born without breath, who grew into silence, who never cried, only drew on walls and skin and dirt. When the townspeople tried to bury her drawings, the town burned down. They said she laughed when the smoke came, said she swallowed it like it was air. Then, just as the last roof caved in, she walked into the fire. They never found her bones. The story was treated like folklore, buried like Elbridge, never written into any sermon or Sunday lesson. But the name Ward had returned. Penrose brought the tale to Annalise in the attic, not speaking it as a threat, but a question. She did not answer. She only took his hand gently, turned his palm up, and with her finger drew a spiral on his skin. Then a second, then a third, a trinity of smoke trails. Beneath the floorboards, she had been hiding something new: ashes, not fireplace soot. These were finer, paler, almost white, gathered in vials, tucked into folded pages. When asked where she got them, she pointed to the walls. The drawings. Some were gone now, not torn, burned from the inside. The images curled inward, singed not at the edges, but at the heart, as if some ember had bloomed inside the paper itself. That night, when Sister Winifred caught her whispering into the cracks in the wall, she leaned closer, only to hear the girl murmuring in a voice that wasn't hers. I told them not to bury me. I told them I would come back. The ashes were tested. Nothing matched local soil. One vial was later confirmed to contain fragments of scorched tooth enamel, human, pre-industrial, likely from the late 18th century. Penrose didn't sleep for days. When he returned to the attic, a fresh drawing waited for him, a figure of flame, walking calmly through a burning church. The congregation sat still in their pews, melting. And above them all, carved into the rafters in jagged, frantic script, the name repeated over and over: Ward, Ward, Ward. It wasn't the drawing that startled them this time. It was the map that came with it. Folded with care, sealed with wax that smelled faintly of burnt cedar, the parchment showed a church no one recognized. Not Fogwood's small chapel, nor the neighboring parish in Belmare. This one was larger, stone-bricked, cruciform in shape, with twin spires and a crypt beneath it. Annalise had drawn it with obsessive precision, even the moss growth on the northern wall, even the broken slat in the steeple window. Beneath the altar, she had scrawled a narrow passage leading into the ground. At first, Penrose dismissed it as imagination. Another ruin, maybe. Another echo of the past seeping through her bones. But the sisters turned pale. Not because they knew the place, but because they didn't. Fogwood Orphanage had once been a chapel, built on the foundation of something older, but no one knew what. The blueprints had been lost. No photographs survived before the renovation. Still, something in the drawing struck like a memory just out of reach. That week, lightning struck the bell tower during a storm. The blaze was swift but contained, burning through only the front vestibule and parts of the southern wall. When they cleared the debris, they found what had been buried beneath it: a staircase, carved into the earth, sealed with mortar until the fire cracked it open like a wound. The passage led to a stone arch, and under that arch, the remains of another chapel, its pews rotted, altar blackened, pulpit collapsed inward. The walls bore symbols none of the sisters recognized: crosses with the arms bent upward, a sun with too many rays, and rows of tally marks, some etched into the stone with such force the rock itself had split. At the center of the old nave lay a single iron ring, bolted into the floor. A trapdoor, long rusted shut. Penrose didn't open it. He didn't need to, because when they returned upstairs, Annalise had already drawn what lay below it: a circular chamber, lined with bones, candles still burning despite the years, and in the center, a cradle, empty, except for soot. When asked how she knew, Annalise whispered, "I was baptized there, before the name was mine." That night, another page surfaced, slid under Penrose's bed while he slept. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was the map again, but this time, the church had been removed. All that remained was a hollow square, and in the corner, in delicate handwriting, the phrase, "It was never built, it was remembered." Penrose hadn't intended to look into his own blood. He had come to Fogwood for maps, for bones, for the strange rhythm between memory and ink that Annalise carried in her sleep. But as the girl's drawings grew sharper, more ancient, more specific, something in him began to twist. One sketch stopped him cold: a coastline shaped like a spine, a spit of land with no name, no record, but which he had seen before once, in an old journal tucked in his grandfather's chest, wrapped in oilskin and silence. The journal had belonged to Elias Penrose, a cartographer in the mid-1800s, famous for his accurate records of post-colonial territories, infamous for what he refused to map. There were entire regions he marked only with a single word: "Here there is nothing." Penrose had always thought it poetic, an eccentric shrug, until now, because Annalise had filled in one of those blanks. Her sketch wasn't just accurate. It was layered the terrain before settlement, during ruin, and after abandonment. Three versions of the same place, coexisting. The map moved when tilted, like the memory of it refused to stay still. Digging through archives, Penrose discovered something long buried. Elias had been tried quietly, not publicly, for forging government documents. His maps had shown places no one wanted remembered, towns not on any census, landmarks claimed never to have existed. Before his execution, Elias had scrawled a final note in the margin of a letter: "I did not create the lie. I only followed the girl who could not forget." There was a sketch with it, a child's hand, smudged, and a name: A. Ward. Penrose's heart cracked in that moment, not from fear but from the weight of inevitability. Annalise was not the first. She was not even the second. She was part of something threaded through time, appearing in centuries like bruises on history's skin, and somehow always near his bloodline. He found birth records erased, pages torn from family Bibles, a daughter of Elias unnamed, hidden, possibly stillborn. But Elias had written of her often. She draws in sleep, he wrote, maps places I never dared visit. Sometimes she weeps when she draws. But only afterward. When Penrose returned to Fogwood, he brought the old journal. He left it on Annalise's cot. She didn't open it right away. She only ran her fingers across the cover, then pressed her palm to it, like greeting something she already knew. That night, she placed a new drawing under Penrose's door. It showed a man his likeness, unmistakable, standing in a clearing, staring at a well that had no bottom. Above the well, something hung from the trees. A compass, split in two, and on its broken face, the word return etched where north should be. The drawing came without warning, folded beneath Penrose's morning tea, so thin and delicate it looked like it had been drawn in smoke. It showed a bell tower, but with no bell. The structure loomed tall, skeletal, each beam inked with an exactness that suggested Annalise had stood beneath it. There were no people, no sky, no surrounding trees, just the tower, and at its base, a hatch outlined in thick, uneven strokes. Penrose recognized the shape instantly. He had seen that frame before, half swallowed by ivy on the edge of a long-abandoned chapel outside Calrow Hill. It had been deemed structurally unsound, chained off since the war. He made the journey alone. The bell tower was still there, but smaller than the drawing, made it seem hollow and blackened. Its roof slanted, the metal fastenings rusted to bone. There was no bell. Only the crossbeam where it once hung, now split and sagging. But beneath it, as promised, was a square of stone, half covered in moss, with rusted hinges buried just beneath the soil. It had not been opened in decades. He pried at it until his palms blistered. It took hours. When the trapdoor finally gave way, it exhaled a smell like paper, left in a coffin old, dry, but not dead. The ladder rotted away beneath the first rung, but Penrose climbed down anyway, boots slipping along the damp stone as he descended into silence. The room below was small and circular, lined with clay shelves. Each shelf held only one thing, a bell. Not large, not ceremonial, small, handheld, meant to be rung close to the ear. Each was tagged with a name. Some had dates, some did not. At the center of the room sat a bell larger than the others, the kind used in monasteries to mark the hour of death. It had no clapper, no rope, no sound. Its surface was covered in scratches, marks made by fingernails, not tools. And on its rim, carved so faint it could be missed entirely, were the words, "They never heard me." Penrose took nothing from the room. He left it exactly as it was, resealed the trapdoor, and marked the site with a single white ribbon. When he returned to Fogwood, Annalise was already waiting in the chapel. She didn't speak. She only reached into her pocket and pulled out a shard of brass, small, curved, and unmistakably a fragment of a bell. She placed it in his hand and turned away. That night, Penrose dreamed of a bell tower standing in a field of frost. He stood at its base, calling out, voice raw, waiting for the toll that never came. And somewhere far above him, something turned to look down, but made no sound. She never cried when she drew, not when sketching skeletons folded beneath swamp roots, not when etching the faces of long-dead children whose names she should not have known. But now, her hands trembled. Her lips parted in shallow, breathless gasps. The charcoal cracked under her grip. She was drawing something she didn't want to. The sisters watched from the doorway, frozen. The image forming on the page was unmistakable. Fogwood Orphanage. But not as it was now, no, this was after. Roof peeled back, flames spilling through broken glass, shadows of children trapped behind barred windows, their mouths open, but no sound emerging. The fire didn't consume the paper. It grew on it, stroke by stroke, until the page felt hot to the touch. Sister Agnes stepped forward, voice shaking. "Stop drawing that one." But Annalise didn't look up. Her eyes were glazed, distant. Her other hand gripped the hem of her dress so tightly the threads began to snap. "They locked the wrong door," she whispered. "They thought it was the wind, but it wasn't." Penrose arrived moments later, summoned by panic. He knelt beside her, tried to cover the drawing, but her hand moved around his like water, continuing the sketch with eerie precision. Every board of the stairwell, every rosary burning on the necks of the sisters, and in the final corner, scrawled as if by another hand entirely, was a shape, long, tall, robed in black, standing in the very hallway where they stood now, watching. "She doesn't want to come here," Annalise whispered, "but she will, if they forget." "Forget what?" Penrose asked, heart hammering. She paused, then pointed to the chapel window. "The bell. It has to ring, even if no one hears it." That night, Penrose climbed to the tower alone and rang the cracked bell. The sound didn't echo, it barely left the metal. But in the attic, Annalise finally put down her charcoal. The drawing was done. She folded it neatly, slid it beneath her pillow, and slept for the first time in days. But the next morning, Sister Winifred found ash beneath Annalise's bed again. Not much, just enough to blacken the floorboards in a perfect square, as if one piece of the drawing had already started to happen. And when Penrose unfolded the page to study it once more, he found a final detail added in the margins, a child watching the fire from the woods. Alone, face turned away. But her hands were covered in soot, and she was still holding the charcoal. They told themselves it was for her safety. That the whispers in town, the newspaper column titled "The Devil's Little Cartographer," the priests who came uninvited to mutter rites under their breath, none of it was her fault. But still, they turned the key. The attic had always been used for storage. Dust-thick trunks, broken cribs, hymnals, too weathered to keep in pews. Now it was her world. A single cot, a cracked mirror, and a single window that faced nothing but mist. She did not scream. She did not cry. She only sat, still as breath, until the night returned, and her fingers began to twitch. They took away her ink. They took away the charcoal, the pencils, the paper. But they didn't take her hands. Penrose visited on the third day. He found her cross-legged on the wooden floor, head tilted as if listening to something far beneath them. Around her, etched in strokes that had no business being as clean as they were lines, hundreds of them interwoven like veins, forming a map so complex it was nearly three-dimensional. Roads intersected and folded into tunnels. Rivers bled into corridors. Buildings cracked open to reveal rooms inside rooms. At the very center sat Fogwood Orphanage, its roof scorched, windows shattered. He knelt closer and realized what she had used. Not ink, not soot, but blood, dried brown in some places, still glistening in others. "Annalise," he whispered, throat tight. "Where did this come from?" She looked up at him, eyes glassy and wide, and raised her palms. They were torn, tiny cuts from her own fingernails, from splinters in the wood, from teeth, maybe. "It had to be drawn," she said. "If I don't draw it, it forgets how to happen. And then it happens worse." He tried to clean her hands, but she flinched. "It's not done," she muttered. "There's still the hallway, still the cellar, still the one who knocks 3 times. He froze. No one had spoken of the knocking aloud. It had only been heard once by Sister Agnes at dawn, and once by Penrose himself, the week prior, just after Matron Ellen went missing for 5 hours with no memory of where she'd been. 3 knocks, always at the same time, always behind a door that opened to nothing. "You're remembering it too, aren't you?" she asked him. "You just don't know how to draw." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Because just then, from the far side of the attic, came a soft knock. 1, 2, 3, but there was no door there. Only wall, only wood, only a part of the map she hadn't yet finished. It started with the boots' mud-crusted prints that trailed up the path to Penrose's quarters, but never away from them. At first, he thought it a groundskeeper, a wandering drunk, something with explanation. But the prints came every night, even when it hadn't rained, even when he placed salt at the door and watched it stay undisturbed. He began hearing, humming, low and uneven, like a hymn sung by someone who had forgotten the words centuries ago. He dismissed it until the third time he found his curtains parted when he was certain they'd been drawn. The fourth time, he saw the man, standing by the marsh just past the chapel. A tall silhouette in clothes so old they seemed stitched from shadow. His arms hung long at his sides, unmoving. But the eyes, those were what paralyzed Penrose. They were not lit with malice or recognition, but with something colder, remembrance. As if they had seen him before, not as he was, but as he had once been, long before he was ever born. Penrose stumbled back into his room and tore through Annalise's sketches until he found it. An early one, folded and nearly faded. A figure drawn standing on the edge of a riverbank, barefoot, long coat, a wide-brimmed hat that hid most of his face, except the eyes pale, lidless, and ringed in black. Beneath the sketch, she had written one word in small, careful script: Watcher. That night, Penrose barricaded his door. He lit every candle he owned. But the man did not come to the door. Instead, he came to the window. Not with a knock, not with a scream, just a stare. Unmoving, unblinking. The next morning, Penrose followed the prints backward. They led into the marsh. The water swallowed sound. The reeds hissed like teeth. He walked until the path narrowed to mud, until even the birds stopped calling. Then he saw it, another drawing, nailed to a tree with a bone. The paper was damp but still legible. It showed the man standing at the foot of Fogwood Orphanage, one hand raised, not in threat, but in command. Children stood behind him in rows, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. And in the sky above, a map unrolled itself in flame. Penrose tore it down, heart racing. When he turned back, the path behind him had vanished. No prints, no trail, no sound. Only the reflection in the water beside him, his own face, and the man's, standing just behind him, eyes locked, waiting. But when Penrose turned, there was no one there. Only the map, now folded in his pocket, still warm, still wet, and pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. It was a drawing that shimmered, not literally, but somehow the charcoal gave the illusion of light dancing on water. Annalise handed it to Penrose without a word. The lake was unmistakable, still water, the largest body of water within 20 miles, placid and glassy, always oddly warm, even in winter. The image showed rooftops visible just beneath the surface, a church steeple rising like a finger from the deep, and strange windows staring out from where windows shouldn't be angled downward, buried beneath silt. The scale was impossible, yet it felt precise. Penrose took it to the archives, where an old surveyor's map confirmed what no one had ever said aloud. Stillwater Lake had been artificially expanded in the late 1800s. The original reason, flood control. But there were whispers, notes in the margins, words like containment and unsuitable for habitation. With funding from the diocese and pressure from Penrose, a team of divers was assembled. It took them 3 days to find it. The sonar hit stone on the lakebed where no stone should have been. On the fourth dive, they surfaced with trembling voices and a single artifact, a crucifix made of carved bone, too smooth, too old, with no markings of Christian origin. One diver refused to go back under. The others did, and what they brought back wasn't proof, it was fear. Footage blurred and grainy, shapes that moved without current, windows that seemed to shift as they swam past. One diver surfaced, screaming, claiming something had looked back. When Penrose showed Annalise the crucifix, her lips split without injury, and a single drop of blood rolled down her chin. It was hers, she said. The one who waited, the one they buried in water because earth wasn't strong enough to hold her. That night, she drew again, a staircase winding downward, beneath the lake, beneath the mud, beneath the bones. At the bottom stood a house, and in every window of that house was a child. Eyes closed, hands pressed to the glass, waiting, she whispered as she drew. They dream there, but they do not sleep. Penrose awoke the next morning to find his boots damp, despite never having left his room. On the bedside table, A note had been placed in the same delicate script that always unnerved him. Stillwater was built to silence them, not to save us. Later that week, one of the divers went missing. His boat was found adrift, circling in slow loops on the lake's surface. No body, no splash, only his oxygen tank placed neatly on the deck, and beside it, a page from Annalise's drawings, one no one remembered giving him. It showed a man, halfway submerged, hand raised in farewell, eyes still wide open beneath the water. Professor Elbridge arrived under the guise of academic curiosity, but his eyes betrayed a deeper hunger. He was no stranger to stories like Annalise's tales of second sight, of children touched by things older than language, but he had never seen it rendered so precisely, so persistently. He brought with him books bound in cracked leather, field notes from dead men, and maps that had no compass, no border, just terrain shaped by memory instead of geography. He watched Annalise draw in silence for an hour, then another, then another. When she finally paused, he whispered, "She's not imagining, she's remembering." He believed Annalise was a vessel not for spirits, not for ghosts, but for the earth itself, that the land, wounded and buried beneath layers of settlement and silence, had chosen her to speak. "The soil keeps memory," he said to Penrose that night. "Just as blood keeps ancestry, there are things this country has paved over, burned, rewritten. But the dirt remembers, the water remembers. She is remembering for it." Penrose wanted to dismiss it, but how could he, when every sketch had come to pass? When old maps were proven false by the paper of a girl with no formal education? Elbridge called it geological memory transference, a theory he claimed had cost him tenure. But he'd seen it before, half-formed in children born near fault lines, in nightmares recorded before earthquakes, in lullabies sung by orphans about towns that no longer existed. "But Annalise," he said, "is the clearest signal I've ever seen. No interference, no confusion. Just truth, uninvited." He showed them a diagram, one of her sketches overlaid on ancient land treaties, ghost towns, roots of exiled peoples. The alignment was impossible, exact, down to footpaths that had not been walked in over 100 years. "She's showing us what was hidden," Elbridge said, "and what never should have been." That night, Annalise drew again. But this time, she didn't use charcoal. She tore pages from Elbridge's field notes and dipped a feather into the water collected from Stillwater Lake. The drawings came faster, more violent. Black figures rising from the ground, hollow houses opening their doors, roads bleeding into rivers. And through it all, one phrase repeated in delicate script: "What is buried is not gone." The attic shook, not violently, but like a breath being drawn in, deep and cold. When they returned the next morning, the drawings had stopped. Annalise sat cross-legged, hands clean for the first time in weeks. But on the floorboards around her, in circles like rings of a tree, the sketches had burned themselves into the wood, permanent, etched into the building itself, as if the orphanage had finally begun to remember, too. The paper looked soaked when Penrose first saw it, drenched not in water but in something heavier, something that clung to the fibers like rusted breath. At first glance, it resembled another map, but this one had no roads, no rivers, no structures, only red, thick, arterial lines cut across the page like veins, twisting into strange shapes that pulsed the longer he stared. Annalise had used red pigment scavenged from old ink pots and crushed berries, mixed with something he dared not name. She handed it to him without meeting his eyes. "It's not a place you go," she said quietly. "It's where the going ends." Elbridge examined it next. His fingers shook. "These aren't pathways," he murmured. "They're sites, burial plots, mass graves, unmarked ground." He began cross-referencing it with lost graveyard registries, old war casualties, vanished settlements, and with every confirmation, the map grew heavier in his hand. Because the last mark on the page, small, centered, and encircled, not once but 7 times had a name inked beside it in Annalise's spidery script. A. Ward. Penrose's breath caught. Why would you draw your own grave? She didn't answer. She stared at the wall behind him, like someone listening for thunder too distant to hear. It's not mine yet, she said finally, but it's where she wants me to sleep, the one in the marsh, the one who never stopped walking. You can change it, he said. You always do. You draw it so it doesn't happen. No, she whispered. I draw it because it's going to happen. That night, the red map vanished from Penrose's desk. He searched every drawer, every corner. Gone. In its place, someone had left a compass, split clean down the middle. No direction, no needle, just a circle, cracked open. Later, one of the nuns found the map nailed to the door of the chapel, fluttering like skin in the breeze. The red had darkened, deepened, and on the back, in a hand that wasn't Annalise's, 4 words had been scrawled. She remembers too much. The next morning, Annalise was gone. Her cot untouched, her hands still stained red, prints leading to the attic wall and stopping. No door, no window, just wall. But Penrose placed his palm against it and felt warmth, like something breathing on the other side. And faintly, barely audible beneath the wood, he heard it. 1 knock, then 2, then silence. It began not with smoke, but with silence, the kind that arrives before a storm, thick and unbreathing, as though the world is holding its breath. Fogwood Orphanage had always groaned with noise, footsteps down drafty halls, rosaries clicking, the distant scrape of chairs, but on that night, everything stopped. Then came the scent, not firewood, not candle wax. This was older, sharper, like burning cloth soaked in salt. Sister Agnes was the first to see the flames, blooming behind the chapel's stained glass in red and gold, casting dancing shadows of saints that didn't belong to any scripture. She rang the bell once its fractured sound warbled, not loud enough to wake everyone, but somehow it did. Children poured from beds, coughing, dazed. The nuns shouted names through the rising smoke. Penrose carried 2 boys from the dormitory as beams cracked overhead, like bones snapping under weight. Fire crawled down walls that hadn't been touched in 100 years, seeking places already marked in charcoal. And somewhere inside it all, someone laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not joyful either, just tired, almost like recognition. In the attic, they found only the map burned into the floor now, black lines glowing faintly red. No sign of Annalise, no blood, no body. Just her locket, left neatly on the windowsill, open to a picture no one remembered giving her. A woman, nearly her twin, dressed in mourning black, standing before an older version of Fogwood, its door marked with ash. The fire was declared accidental. Faulty wiring, they said, despite there being no electricity in the attic. Most survived. A few sisters were lost, their names quickly folded into eulogies and left behind. But the children spoke differently. They said they saw her, Annalise, standing in the hallway just before the flames touched the east wing. Her hands were outstretched. Her eyes were open, but shining with reflected fire, and her mouth moved, whispering something they couldn't hear, except one child who would only say this. She told the house to remember her. By dawn, the orphanage was a carcass of blackened stone and soot. Penrose stood among the ruins, the air thick with ash, and stared at the ground where her cot once lay. Burned into the wall above it were 7 small handprints. Beneath them, in soot or something deeper, the words, "Not gone, just beneath." He walked to the edge of the forest that morning, where the fog drifted lower than usual. There, carved into the bark of a single tree, was a new map. Simple, small, just a single path winding through woods, and a house at the end, drawn in blood-red ink. From the chimney rose no smoke, but from the windows, candlelight, and in one of them, a girl's silhouette, watching, waiting, or remembering. Penrose found it 3 weeks after the fire, buried in the roots of a willow tree at the edge of the marsh. The sketchbook was wrapped in oilcloth and twine, as if someone meant for it to survive long after hands had vanished. He opened it on the steps of the half-collapsed chapel, its pages crackling like breath. The first drawings were quiet stone bridges he'd never seen, staircases beneath rivers, towns without names, but with faces in every window. As he turned the pages, the lines sharpened. Her strokes grew faster, more frantic. Some maps looked like veins, others like scars. One depicted a sunken house, upside down beneath a cemetery. Another showed a church surrounded by water, but the reflection in the lake was not of a building, it was of a woman, kneeling, her mouth sewn shut. They were not predictions anymore, they were invitations, warnings, memories pressed into paper before the land swallowed them again. But near the end, the drawings began to fragment, a path that circled itself endlessly, a road that led to its own origin. Then, the final page. It was unfinished, the only one that felt like a question. A house, towering, wrong in its angles, too many windows, all facing inward, and not a single door. No entry, no exit, no way in, unless you were already inside. The house felt aware, not haunted, not built by hands, but grown. Its outline shimmered faintly on the page, as if resisting full form, and in the top right corner, she had written, "You can't walk to it. You have to remember it." Penrose stared at the words for hours, tracing them again and again. The sketchbook closed with a weight that didn't belong to paper. He kept it close, locked in a drawer he never opened without lighting a candle first. But some nights, even that wasn't enough, because the drawing, the house with no doors, started appearing in his dreams. Always distant, always still, always waiting. One night, he woke to find he had drawn it himself, in the dark, with no memory. Same lines, same shape, same chill creeping beneath his ribs. Only now, the drawing was complete. And this time, in one of the windows, a figure, just a shape, small, slight, but unmistakable. A girl, watching him from inside. They waited for spring before going. The ground had to thaw, the ice had to lift, and the townspeople needed time to forget the smoke that once curled from Fogwood's bones. But Penrose didn't forget. He carried the final sketchbook like scripture, tracing its pages by candlelight each night until one map began to shift, subtle at first, then impossible to deny. A hill behind the orchard, long thought to be a burial mound, now showed a hollow at its center. It was not marked as a grave, it was marked as home. The search party was small: Penrose, two laborers from the village, and Elbridge, who had returned with shaking hands and a satchel full of salt. They climbed the hill at dawn, their breath trailing like ghosts behind them. The ground gave easily, too easily, as though it had been waiting. Beneath the tangled roots and soft rot was an entrance, a narrow tunnel descending into blackness. The air smelled of earth and something sweeter, like candle wax still warm. They crawled down one by one, lanterns casting shadows that moved without cause. And then they saw it. A room, small, round, womb-like, carved by hand. The walls were smooth dirt, and in the center sat a wooden bed, too small for a grown child, perfectly made. On it, a pillow. On the pillow, a locket, open. Beside the bed, a candle flickered, fresh, burning, low, but alive. No wax dripped. No wick burned down. It simply was. But the wall, that's what stopped them cold. Someone had drawn on it, finger to dirt. A sprawling map, unfinished but pulsing with detail. Rivers, forests, names in languages no one had taught Annalise. And at the center, the same house, the one with no doors. Only now, it had a window open, just one. Above the sketch, a message scrawled in the same script they'd seen on every page. Somewhere, I am still drawing. Elbridge fell to his knees. Penrose didn't speak. He pressed his palm to the wall. It was warm, faintly, as if someone had just left. No sign of Annalise. No footprints in or out, but her presence soaked the chamber like breath in a closed room. They sealed the hollow behind them, not with concrete, not with stone, just dirt, quietly, carefully, as if tucking in a sleeping child. Penrose didn't return to Fogwood, not for years. But sometimes, late at night, He'd wake to find his own walls covered in sketches he hadn't drawn. Not maps, not places, just a window, just one. Slowly, opening wider, it started in a schoolhouse 2 towns over, just beyond the hills where fogwood once smoldered in memory. A little girl, no older than 7, stood in the corner during art hour, silent, methodical, charcoal smudged up to her wrists. Her teacher approached, expecting another farmhouse, another sun. But the drawing wasn't sweet. It was unsettling, too precise. A vast field, ringed with stones that leaned like tired men, a staircase leading down into nothing, and in the corner, a signature, barely legible but deliberate, A. W. They thought it coincidence at first. But then, a boy in a neighboring village began sketching a spiral path no one recognized, except Penrose, who had seen the same curl in a page left under his pillow weeks after the fire. Soon, more surfaced. Drawings passed between children like whispers depicting places that did not exist, and yet were: a lighthouse buried beneath dirt, a chapel where rain fell upward, a school bell ringing in a forest that had no name. And always, somewhere hidden in the margins, the same looping initials: A. W. No one taught them. No one asked them to draw, but they did, and they could not stop. Some claimed they had seen her in dreams, a girl with quiet hands, a voice that spoke not in words but in memories, laid flat and heavy like fog. She never told them what to draw, only what not to forget. Penrose grew old, watching the sketches multiply, pouring in from places even he had never visited. Some he recognized, most he did not. Yet all carried that same fingerprint of knowing, of grief, of warning. He began to believe that Annalise hadn't vanished at all, not in fire, not in earth. She had diffused, become part of the land she once translated, a cartographer not of geography, but of memory itself, drawing not just to recall, but to preserve. The world had buried too much bodies, truths, entire towns, and now the remembering had begun again. At night, he would sit beside the last map she gave him, now framed but never covered, and listen to the scratching sounds just beyond the walls. Children, somewhere, were drawing, and the house with no doors was still watching, its windows now all open, waiting. Because what is buried is not gone, and what is drawn cannot be erased. The map never ends. It only waits for the next hand. If you made it this far, ask yourself, how does a child draw what was never told? Like this video, subscribe to the Black Chapter, and turn on notifications because the next story might already be unfolding somewhere forgotten.